So if you were wondering how I'm doing, it is 11:30 a.m. on Monday morning and I am drinking a very large, very alcoholic beverage. So I am being a tad dramatic. This is the penultimate video that I have to film for 2022 before I take the rest of the year off. So we're celebrating a little bit and I do need to be a little bit tipsy for the next video that's coming. So I needed a little bit of a head start. There is definitely more alcohol in here than not alcohol. It's a Black Russian, for those of you who are wondering as well. So it's like equal parts Tia Maria, vodka and Coke, or it's supposed to be, but I'm always a little bit heavy-handed with the Tia Maria and vodka and not quite so heavy-handed with the Coke. So for those of you who've been around a while, you will know that I make this video every single year. Today we are going to be tier ranking all of the 2022 releases that I've read. Now I make this video for a couple of reasons. One is that I kind of wanted to do a wrap-up or discussion of all of the 2022 releases or books released in the year that I'm making the video, but with the amount that I read, it would take quite a long time if I did it as a traditional video, so I decided that we would do this as a tier ranking. Obviously, you guys know, if you consume any bookish content, that things like new releases have a tendency to get a little bit hyped, and I'm not saying that I only read hype new releases. Some of these books I've read in 2022 you guys may have never heard of, but this video for me is a way of showing you guys what, in my opinion, was not as hyped in hindsight as it was at the time of release. And even if I was somebody who was getting into the hype at the time of release, something that's interesting about this video is it goes off my enjoyment in hindsight. So I could have given a book 4 stars 6 months ago, and now that I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking, did this leave a lasting impression on me? And if not, it will come way lower down the tier ranking than you would expect it to. So we're just gonna crack into it, but we are going to go through the tiers before we start with any of the rankings. So we have 5 tiers. These tiers are the same every year. The highest tier is Obsessed, and this is a book that I adored, a book that I would consider rereading in the future, a book that is maybe now one of my favorite books of all time. We then have Need a Sequel Like Yesterday. This is a book that I really enjoyed to the point where what I received was not good enough. Like, I want more from this story. So even if it's a standalone, would I read any more books in this world following these characters in this style by the same author? The middle tier is just good. This is a book that I enjoyed. I thought it was good, but maybe it didn't leave a massive lasting impression on me. I was satisfied with what I got from this book, and I wouldn't necessarily read anything else by this author or anything else set in this world. The next tier is Forgettable. So these are books that could have been good in the moment, they could have been enjoyable, but now thinking about them, I don't remember any of the finer details. In a couple of years, it's unlikely that I'll remember that I even read this book to begin with. And the final tier is very dramatic and not one that we use all that often, but it is Burning My Eyeballs Would Have Been More Enjoyable, and it is essentially a book that I just wish I'd never read. Like, I gained nothing from this. It wasn't enjoyable when I was reading it, and now I only have really negative thoughts about it. Wish I'd never read it, and that is what we reserve this bottom tier for. So we're going to be going through these in no particular order. It's just the order that they have been put into the tier ranking thing. And we are going to be starting off with The Monarchs by Danielle Page and Cass Morgan. So this is the sequel to The Ravens. It's like a new adult witchy slasher about this group of girls at a sorority, and sorority members start to go missing. We have 2 perspectives. We have like the legacy witch, and we have a girl who didn't know that she was a witch until she joined the Ravens, and together they have to figure out what's happening to the sorority members. Now in the sequel, The Monarchs, it is pretty much more of the same. It's like a self-contained plot that does kind of deal with the events of the end of the Ravens, but you could pretty much read this as a standalone because the plot in this one is self-contained. I actually really enjoy this series. It falls into that category of books that you wouldn't actually expect me to like, where it's like a contemporary fantasy with just something that adds a little bit of spice. In this case, the fact that it's a sorority of witches, and we also have this like slasher plot going on in the background as well. So even though it's a duology and it's now done, I think that Cass Morgan and Danielle Page could continue to write books in this series if they wanted to, just with each one having a self-contained plot like they've done with the first 2 books. So I'm going to put Need a Sequel Like Yesterday, because while I was satisfied with what it was. If they did write any more books in this series, I would absolutely read them. Next up, we have Beautiful Nightmares by KJ Sutton, which is the newest installment in one of my favorite series of all time. It's my favorite indie fantasy romance series. It's a fairy romance with other paranormal creatures as well. And we're following a young woman called Fortuna, who is a nightmare, which means that she has the power to make people believe that they're experiencing their worst nightmares. So her brother has actually gone missing. He's been missing for 2 years and she's given up hope, up until a very powerful fairy male approaches her and says, I know where your brother is and I will take you directly to him if you marry me. So she does. There are multiple love interests in this series. It's not reverse harem or poly or anything at the minute. It's more like a triangle square kind of situation, but all of the love interests are equally as appealing. I have a favorite, but I do also see the appeal of some of the others as well. I think that Beautiful Nightmares in particular was the best installment in the series so far. Even though I've rated all of them 5 stars, my one criticism of the first 2 books is that there's a lot of plot there with a really fast pace where we could really benefit from slowing it down, stretching out the book a little bit, and maybe exploring some of these plot elements a little bit more, which is what was done in Beautiful Nightmares. So I'm gonna go ahead and pop this in Obsessed because I do think that this is actually going to be on my best books of the year list as well. Next up, we have another KJ Sutton book, which is The Door at the End of the Stars. This one was very different. It's kind of a little bit like Dollhouse, which is a Joss Whedon show, and it is a romantic suspense. It is about a woman who is trying to make extra money to support her family, and so she enters this dollhouse-like institute where people can wear your body to do whatever they want with it for 24 hours. However, the problem is that our main character is actually awake and present when she shouldn't be, when other people have control of her body, and she soon starts to realize that it's one person who's taking her body again and again and again, and the reason why they're doing it is because they're trying to get close to a married man. Now, I really enjoyed this. I thought the pacing was great. It kept me hooked. It was compelling. I was continually turning pages, but I do feel like the ending of it was a little bit rushed, and I don't feel like I fully understood the motivations of some of the characters in here. So I am going to put this in good. I would definitely read, well, I read everything that Kelsey writes, but I think that romantic suspense is not my favorite genre that she's written in. Next up, we have The Golden Couple by Greer Hendricks and Sarah Pekkanen. This is a thriller. Thrillers for me are very much enjoyable in the moment. They're for me to have a good time while I'm reading them, but it is very rare that a thriller leaves a lasting impression on me. So this one, I can't even tell you too much about what the actual plot is in this moment. I remember it being about a couple who go to couples therapy, and the wife hasn't told her husband why she actually wants them to go to couples therapy, and the actual reason turns out to be a little bit more than her husband anticipated. And it is also about a therapist who the couple go to that has actually had her license revoked for unconventional practices, and it was just different than I expected it to be. I did enjoy it at the time, but right now, like with most thrillers that I read it for a good time. I had a good time, and now I remember nothing. So for me, it's going to be going into the forgettable category, which we have one in the top 4. Now, it's only Burning Eyeballs that's missing a book at this stage. So next up, we have a little novella that I've only just read. It's Sweet Sin by Savar Miller. This one comes before the main series, and Savar Miller is a author who's actually going to be at Rare London, which is a romance convention that I will be attending. I did want to have a video of all of the authors that are attending that I would like to read before the end of the year. However, with my schedule, I just couldn't squeeze it in, so that is coming. I've already started preparing, already started reading, but the video will only be coming in February now. But this is a prequel novella to the series. The series is one that I've wanted to read for a long time. The first book, Promises and Pomegranates, I'm currently 12% of the way through, and it is a Mafia romance series, with the first book and the first couple being loosely inspired by Hades and Persephone. So this one is just a little bit of what happens before the beginning of the series, because we're following a Mafia princess, I guess. I've never read a Mafia romance. This is all very new to me, but her father has arranged for her to marry this guy from a different family for the connections, and the guy that he uses to actually kill people from him, like his friend, is in love with his daughter. So in the actual book, it turns out that there's a little bit of something going on between the guy, like the head of this family, and his friend, and the friend essentially blackmails the father into getting him to marry his daughter. So this prequel novella is a little bit of a altercation they had. It's not an altercation, a moment they had before the start of the actual book. It's smutty, it's a little bit dark, and I had a really good time with it. So I'm gonna go with need a sequel like yesterday. Technically I'm already reading the sequel, but essentially I just enjoyed it enough to want more from it. Next up we have Saga Volume 10, which honestly broke my heart. Saga Volume 9 properly broke my heart. Saga Volume 10 just didn't put it back together, essentially. So Saga is one of my favorite series of all time. Volume 10 was never going to be what volumes 1 to 9 were, because of what happened in volume 9. Essentially, it's like Romeo and Juliet set in space. We're following characters from a warring planet and moon, and they end up falling in love and having a baby, even though it's illegal. So there's bounty hunters from all over the world trying to hunt them down and kill them, and they just want to be in love and raise their daughter in peace. So volume 10 is a little bit of a time jump from volume 9, and the first 9 volumes of this comic is more about the baby's parents and their journey up until she comes of an age where she can start to take over the story herself. And in volume 10 is where we finally start to see her do that. Now, in terms of all of the Saga volumes that I've ever read, it absolutely wasn't my favorite. So much is different from how it was for reasons that I just don't think personally that the second arc of this comic can ever hit me as much as the first half did, because of how much I love the first half. Regardless, I am very excited to see what the future holds. I'm hoping that the series is going to, even though it's going in a different direction, kind of rekindle some of those feelings that I had in the first half. So we're gonna go with need a sequel like yesterday, because I am eager to see what comes next in this series. Witchy Volume 2, this is another comic. It's a bind up of a webcomic, and this is sad, I actually can't remember too much about it right now, but it is a YA comic that I didn't really think much of, and I ended up really enjoying it. Set in this witch kingdom where the strength of your magic is related to the length of your hair. So the longer your hair is, the more powerful you are. But if you're too powerful, you get exiled and like burned for being a witch. Our main character saw her father be burned as a witch when she was a child, and so she's disguised her hair this entire time because she doesn't want people to know that she's powerful. However, it's coming around to the trials where the power of people is tested, and the strongest ones end up being recruited into the army. They find out that she does actually have really long hair. They recruit her into the army, and she ends up going on the run because that's not like, she doesn't want to have anything to do with this because of what happened to her father. I actually really enjoyed it, and I'm gonna put witchy right now. I'm gonna put it in good because I feel like my feelings have waned since I read it, but I would definitely recommend this, and I think like when eventually I pick up volume 3, my interest once again will be a little bit like reignited. Hook, Line and Sinker by Tessa Bailey is an interesting one because I gave this one 5 stars. I loved it, and I read it straight off the back of reading It Happened One Summer, which I didn't enjoy, and gave 3 stars to because there was things that I liked, things that I didn't like. Overall, wasn't a hit with me, but I loved Hook, Line and Sinker. So this is the second book in the Bellinger Sisters duology, where we're following these sisters who have been raised in LA, even though they were originally born in this very small fishing town. So after one incident too many, the oldest sister is banished to this fishing town and told to get her shit together and live a little bit more humbly. Along the way, she falls in love with a fisherman, and her sister is also backwards and forwards to the town because she's obviously visiting her sister. During the course of the first book, she meets this guy called Fox, who is a crab fisherman, and the second book, Hook, Line and Sinker, is about them. She works on the set of a movie, and she has recommended this town as the perfect setting for this movie, so she goes there to shoot with the crew, and while she's there, she stays with Fox, who has a reputation as a little bit of a ladies' man, and he's really interested in Hannah, but he doesn't want her to think that he's only interested in her for one thing or like to ruin their friendship. So I love Mere Friends to Lovers when it's done well. I really like the trope of this playboy or ladies man who's absolutely gorgeous but doesn't want to be seen like that anymore. We also see a little bit of it in The Hating Game by Sally Thorne, which is one of my favorite books of the year. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. Now, do I want more from this? I don't think so, because realistically there was more from it, or more in a similar vein, in It Happened One Summer, and I actually didn't enjoy that book. So I think I'm going to be putting Hook, Line and Sinker in good. Oh, I could go obsessed. I might go with obsessed actually, because a really, really solid romance, really, really loved it. Potential for me to reread it. Maybe not one of my favorite books ever, but I definitely don't want any more from it because It Happened One Summer was that, and I didn't actually enjoy that one all that much. Next up we have The Blood Trials, which is a adult sci-fi about a girl whose grandfather has been murdered in a very racist society, and she is at the Praetorian trials. She joins a series of trials to get his job, but she doesn't want to do it originally because she's grieving the loss of her grandfather, and then she finds out from his friend that her grandfather was actually probably murdered, and she joins this trial to get close to the person that her grandfather's advisor has told her is the suspect. I really enjoyed this. I gave it 4 stars. It was recommended to me a lot because of its similarity to Red Rising, and I definitely understand that. My issue with this is that the main character is too impulsive and she doesn't have a thought. Like, her grandfather's advisor tells her that this guy is to blame and she just goes along with it, even ignoring her own kind of signs that this guy might not actually be a bad guy. And if somebody tells her something, she just kind of takes it at face value and runs with it. My main issue though, because it provided a fun reading experience, I guess, but my main issue is that this was just too fast paced. At around the 2/3 mark is where this book should have ended, and that should have been like stretched out a bit, and the last third of this book should have been an entirely separate book. So I think this has a lot of potential. I'm very much excited to read the sequel, but I think because of the pacing, I have retained less about this than I thought I was going to. So I'm gonna put this in need a sequel like yesterday, because based on this, even though the pacing of this wasn't perfect, I think this should have been a trilogy, not a duology. I will definitely read more from the author in the future because I feel like there's a lot of potential there. Age of Ash by Daniel Abraham, who is one half of the authors that write Leviathan Wakes, which is James S.A. Corey, I believe. And I was excited about this based on just that, because I know that Leviathan Wakes, that series, is extremely beloved. This one, I haven't seen a synopsis for the sequel yet, but this is a series about a city, and I think that each book is going to take place in a slightly different time period, but with like recurring threads. Now, because of that, this is a very character-driven book, but from the perspective of the city being a character. So I think in concept, this is very interesting, but I think in execution, it was actually quite dull. Up until around the halfway point, we did get an interesting thread through that, and I did say when I read it I would wait to see what the second book maybe held before I made a decision on this series. But right now, it being at least 6 months since I read this one, I can now confirm I have no interest in continuing, so we're going to put this one in forgettable, because I did actually enjoy it a little bit. Oh no, House of Sky and Breath by Sarah J Maas. I know that I rated this 5 stars because I love House of Earth and Blood, okay? It is still my favorite book ever. It's a fantasy romance, an adult epic fantasy romance set in a city that is ruled by angels. We're following Bryce Quinlan, who is a half-fae woman who is tasked with investigating this string of murders because she has a personal connection to not the murderer, but like the murders as a whole. And because it's dangerous, she is assigned a fallen angel in the form of Hunt Athalar to protect her along the way. The first book is a book about trauma and recovery and healing and friendship, and I adored it. The second book was super slow. It introduced new perspectives, which I understand why she's done it, but the whole thing about the second book is that it suffers from second book syndrome. It is all set up for the third book. The new character perspectives that we have introduced are not necessary in this book, but you can tell, especially based on the ending, that they are going to be necessary in the third book, which is why they've been introduced here. Now, I personally it wasn't the most riveting read, but because I love the characters and love the world that has been created so much and love the Easter egg hunting, I did not mind the bulk of this book. My issue is with the end, because I love this world and these characters so much that I want this series to be about this world and these characters. I can't say my true opinions on this book until the third book's been released, because like I said, it's all set up. Right now, I don't have great feelings about the end of this book, but when the third book is released, I might change my mind, is essentially what I'm saying here. Even though I gave this 5 stars, in hindsight, it would be a 4 or a 3 star, probably a 4 because I am who I am and I am trash for Sarah J Maas. I'm gonna put this in good, because while I do need a sequel like yesterday, and you can bet I'm dropping everything the second it arrives on my doorstep, I'm scared of a sequel to this book because I think it's going to be everything I don't want it to be, and I do not want that. Next up we have Gallant by V. Schwab. Schwab. So this is about a young girl who is in, I think it's an orphanage, and she receives a letter from her uncle that invites her to the family manor called Gallant, and she goes there and actually finds out that her uncle's dead and nobody wants her there. It's like a haunted house kind of story. I read it like the week before Halloween. I liked the writing. I liked the atmosphere. I could not tell you anything about the story. It has an ambiguity about it as well that I don't generally enjoy in anything, which I feel like contributes to the fact that I can't retain a whole lot of information about it, and also the fact that like I didn't love it all that much. But I will say that if you are a fan of Schwab, if you like an atmospheric, like slightly ghosty story, you might enjoy it. But for me, it's definitely going into forgettable. I did really like it. I think I gave it 4 stars, but in the way where it was enjoyable when I read it, it was a decent time, but it's not made any sort of impression on me. Next up, we have The Butcher and the Wren by Elena Urquhart, which is a book that has sadly disappointed me a bit. So I'm a big fan of the true crime podcast Morbid, and the author of this book is actually one of the hosts of Morbid, and I obviously wanted to support her and support her book, but this typically is a book that I wouldn't read, and that could contribute to the fact that I didn't love it all that much. It's kind of like a crime book, especially because it is a series about this forensic, I think it's a forensic pathologist, like a forensics woman and a serial killer. So he's hunting his victims, she's hunting him down. Both of the characters, so both of the perspectives we have, are very cold, clinical and logical, which makes sense that they're written this way based on their personalities, but I feel like I would have just liked more of a variety of perspective in this book. And the plot twist, I didn't see the plot twist come in, but mainly because there was no foundation laid, like there was no groundwork laid to build up to this plot twist. So sadly, I gave it 3 stars. It was okay. I know that a lot of people were quite scared by the horror elements in here. I personally wasn't, but I feel like that's a me thing because so many people in my comments have said that it really freaked them out and they couldn't continue, because you're essentially reading from the perspective of the serial killer as he's stalking victims. But I Love You by Caroline Kepner, so maybe that's why that didn't bother me at all. But yeah, sadly, this is going in the forgettable pile. I really wanted to love this. I will keep my copy because it's like a signed first edition by Elena, but I don't think I'll continue with this, and if I do, it will be more for the novelty factor if I really want to support the podcast hosts, because literally I'm a fangirl, than actually like enjoying the book. Next up, we have Ordinary Monsters by J.M. Miro, which is one that I have just read. I wanted to love it and I didn't. So this one had a very promising start. It's set in the 1800s, which isn't my favorite time period, but I was fully expecting this to surprise me because there is historical fiction still coming up in this ranking, or historical fantasy, that I, against all odds, I actually enjoyed. But it's set in the 1800s and it's following these children called talents that have an ability. So like one of them glows really brightly and gets really hot, which sounds weak, but like, I mean, in the book, it's a decent ability. One of them heals himself. So like he can be hurt, but he will always heal and he'll never die. They've lived quite hard lives up until the point where 2 recruiters, headhunters from an institute, find them and say that they will take them back to this safe haven called the Kerndale Institute, where children like them are welcome. It's like Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. It's kind of like Umbrella Academy, kind of like X-Men, then kind of vibes. It had great atmosphere. I liked the writing, but it was too long and boring for me, unfortunately. I feel like you need a really dynamic ending to pull off such a slow build, and I just didn't feel like the ending was good enough to make up for that for me. I feel like we have so many characters in here that we're not quite, it's not character driven because we're not getting attached enough to any of them, and the setting, Victorian setting, typically doesn't do it for me. So sadly, didn't love it. Was a 3-star, had some promising things, but overall I feel like my opinion is that it had potential and didn't deliver on that. Oh shit, once again we're going for forgettable on this one. At least we don't have any eyeball burning yet. No, I don't know if we will. We'll see. The more I drink, maybe the more brutal I'll get. I also feel like it was optimistic for me to think that I can drink this entire thing in 2 videos, because that's a lot. Next up, we have Lost in Time by A.G. Riddle, which at the time of filming this is actually the book that I most recently finished. It's not a book about dinosaurs, which you'd think it would be from the synopsis, but it is about a group of scientists, and one of them is murdered. One of them and his daughter is framed for the death of that one scientist, and Their invention is Absalom, which is a very unpredictable, uncontrollable time machine that transports people into a different universe way back in the past, in the time of like dinosaurs. But because they couldn't control the outcome, they decided to market it as this thing to transport prisoners who are on death row outside of the universe. The scientist that is framed for this murder is a victim of his own invention, and he is sent back to the time of dinosaurs, and all of the other scientists are suspects, but the other scientists are also trying to find a way to bring the guy who was framed back because he's one of their oldest and closest friends. I don't know if I'd call it a sci-fi thriller because that's not a genre that I am extremely experienced in, so I couldn't tell you if that was accurate or not, but it was a very fast-paced, compelling, page-turning story centered around this murder mystery. If you throw in time travel in there as well, which we obviously do, it's instantly more complicated and more full of wibbly wobbly timey-wimey stuff, and I really enjoyed that about it. I really enjoyed the twist. The second half of the book took a turn that I wasn't expecting, and I had a great time reading it. But like a thriller, I think, and this is the last book I read, so it's super fresh in my mind right now, I think that in 6 months I won't remember much about this book because it's one of those that was a great time while I was reading it, but I don't think I've taken anything from the book that is going to stay with me for an extended period of time. So we're gonna go with Forgettable again, which is sad because right now I'm in the mindset of good, but I just don't think it's going to stick with me. And there's other books like Night Film by Marisha Pessel, which kind of have some of the same like not themes, but kind of slow, but it's interesting enough to me that it kept me turning pages, so it's super compelling, has like a murder mystery kind of plot, and that has stuck with me. I don't think this one is going to. Her Majesty's Royal Coven by Juno Dawson. I loved this. I had no idea what to expect. I've never read a Juno Dawson book before. I'm pretty sure that this was Juno Dawson's adult debut. Once again, a contemporary fantasy with a witchy element where we are following this coven who are Her Majesty's Royal Coven. Well, they're not actually. They grew up together in Yorkshire. They were all a part of Her Majesty's Royal Coven. One of them is now the High Priestess, but there was this big war between the witches and the warlocks, and the rest of them have left the coven and gone on to do different things. Like one of them is a vet and uses her ability to help the animals that she treats because they were so traumatized by the events of this war that the majority of them don't want anything to do with the coven anymore. But there is this prophecy of the sullied child, and apparently when the sullied child turns up, then the end of days is nigh and this big demon is going to rise. So the priestess of Her Majesty's Royal Coven thinks that she's found the sullied child, and she contacts her friend and asks her friend to try and make a breakthrough with this child because the child is non-communicative, and see if we can stop this sullied child prophecy from coming true by turning this child away from the path of darkness. I loved it. It is a little bit of a fuck you to J.K. Rowling, a little bit of subversion of a lot of things that we see in Harry Potter. I liked it for that, like I liked how that element of it was done, but I also loved it as a story, once again similar to The Monarchs, a contemporary story with a witchy element that I really loved. So for this one, we're going with Need a Sequel Like Yesterday. I'm actually shocked how much I love this because I didn't expect to love it. I didn't expect to hate it, but I didn't know when I picked it up that it was going to be something that has stuck with me, and it truly has. Lore Olympus Volume 2 by, is it Rachel Smith? I have volume 3 here. It's just arrived, and I'm sad because I'm actually probably going to read it before the end of the year and it's not going to make it into this video. We'll just say that Lore Olympus Volume 2 maybe stands in for Volume 3 as well. But Lore Olympus is a bind-up of a webcomic that is a retelling of Hades and Persephone that has been modernized and also has a whole ton of other Greek gods and goddesses in it as well. It brings everyone into the 21st century. There's technology, it's funny, it's relatable, but it also doesn't shy away from some of the dark topics that we see in Greek myth, like domestic abuse and sexual assault and things like that, so do be wary of that. The first volume was 400 pages of mutual pining. The second volume I didn't love as much because it felt like it was intentionally taking it too far away from Hades and Persephone when that is what I wanted to focus on, even if they're not together, even if it's just the mutually pining on their own far away from each other. I just wanted more of that, and Volume 2 didn't deliver. Regardless, like I just said, I have Volume 3 right here, and as soon as I open it I'm gonna read it, so clearly this belongs in Need a Sequel Like Yesterday. Reckless Girls by Rachel Hawkins is another thriller. It's about a group of 20-somethings that go to a desert island. Weird things start happening on the island because I imagine things like there's pictures in my brain when I read. So I have pictures in my brain right now of 2 yachts pulled up side by side, people on them, somebody turning up in a smaller boat, a beach, an island. I can't tell you any of the plot. All I have is this picture. I have a picture of somebody diving off the side of a boat. So quite clearly this is not that I don't know anything about it. I do remember being disappointed because I feel like from the synopsis, it could have lent more into horror elements when it lent more into thriller elements in terms of like, it's not a murder mystery is the thing, but it could have really lent into horror elements and been really spooky and really like chilling with this tropical island and like mysterious things happening. Like, is it dehydration? Are things actually happening? Is it the isolation doing this to the people? And it just went for like a much more basic plot than that. So I'm gonna go Burning My Elbows would have been more enjoyable, not because like it was fine when I read it. So not because I would actually want to burn my eyeballs, but more just because this is beyond forgettable. Not only have I lost the finer points, I've lost everything about this book. The only thing that I remember is that I wish it would have lent into more horror elements, like it kind of led me to believe from the synopsis. Similarly, River of Shadows by Karina Halley. This was my second chance for Karina Halley because I read the first book in the Dark Eyes duology, which is it, I can't remember what it's called. Black Sunshine, I think. Might actually be the one. I read that one, didn't love it. Read this one, didn't love it. This one has an interesting premise though. I think it's Norwegian mythology in it, and it is following a woman who goes to her father's funeral. She gets there, her father owned a resort, and everyone's kind of acting very strangely, and she goes to see her father's body and finds out that it's not there, and somebody tells her that he's actually in the underworld and that he's not actually dead yet, like she has a chance to save him. So she journeys into the underworld to do that. The romance element in here turned out to be, first off, not what I expected it to be, then what I expected it to be, but then at that point I didn't expect it because it had already like changed my mind. Ultimately, I just don't remember anything about it, and I feel like this is the theme with Karina Halley and me. Everything's just fine, but nothing's great, you know? So I do have the sequel to Black Sunshine, which is The Blood Is Love, that I'm going to read, but then I probably won't read anything from Karina Halley again because it's just not working out for me. And I'm sorry, I feel like I'm speaking really, really quickly now. This is, I haven't eaten is the problem, because like realistically, I haven't actually drank that much. I'm not gonna stop though. Next up we have Sunreach by Brandon Sanderson, and is it Jancy Patterson? This is the first of the Skyward novellas. Skyward is a series that I have very complex feelings towards because I love Sanderson. I love Skyward the book. I didn't like the sequel Starsight, but I did really like this novella, but because of how I feel about the series, it's kind of tainted my view of the novella. The series as a whole is about this girl called Spencer whose father is a deserter. They live on a planet. The planet is constantly being attacked by aliens, so they've created this army of fighter pilots, and that's what Spencer's father deserted. So because of that, she is treated terribly by the people in this community, and she cannot follow her dream of also becoming a fighter pilot. So this is about her gaining entry into the school, proving everyone wrong, essentially. I loved it. Spencer is an unlikable character to start off with, but I feel like she really, really grows on you. And then the sequel just did the same thing again with different characters, and I believe that the third book also does the same thing again with different characters. Now, the first novella, Sunreach, actually deals with the characters that I came to adore, that I wanted more of in Starsight, and it's about slugs, and it's funny. It's nothing too serious, but it does discuss things like relevant to the plot. Like there's discoveries that happen in this novella. I had a really, really good time, and it kind of reignited my enjoyment of this series, only for me then to be upset because I've been told like by people who love this series that they don't think that I'm gonna like Cytonic because it's everything that I hated about Starsight. This as itself, I'm gonna put good. I really, really enjoyed it, but I don't want a sequel like yesterday because I'm scared of the sequel. Next up we have The Embroidered Book by Kate Hartfield. And this one is wild because I got this in the Goldsboro subscription, and as soon as I got it, I was like, I hate it. I don't want it. It's about Marie Antoinette and her sister, and they find this book of spells and they do spells. Don't know who Marie Antoinette's sister is. I don't want to read this. I loved this book. I gave this book 4 stars, but I constantly think about it and how much I enjoyed it, even though I never thought I would. I fully went into this book expecting to DNF it. I was like, I'll give it 100 pages. If I don't like it, it's gone. This was so captivating, and I still have no idea why. So we're following Marie Antoinette and her sister Charlotte as the nursemaid, no, it's not a nursemaid, governess. The governess is murdered and she leaves behind this embroidered book of spells. They pick it up and they start to learn spells, and they're trying to change their mother's mind about the fate of one of their sisters, but something tragic happens in the family anyway, and it turns out that Charlotte has to go marry, I think is it Ferdinand of, oh my god, I know this, Ferdinand of Napoli. He's supposed to be a monster, and then Marie Antoinette obviously goes to marry, is it King Louis the IV? We all know how everything ends up with Marie Antoinette, and I know some of you guys who actually, because I'm not a history buff at all, which is probably contributes to the fact why I don't love historical novels. Charlotte goes to marry Ferdinand, and then there's a whole like collapse of the European monarchy that happens throughout like a series of years. I just didn't see how that would be interesting to me, but it completely was. Now I feel like this book, I don't know anything about the French Revolution aside from the basics. I feel like this book painted Marie Antoinette in a more sympathetic light than she deserves to be painted in, but I obviously know nothing about her. I'm basing this off like how people have mentioned in my comments that like she's not a great person, but I do kind of like books like that that provide an ulterior perspective. And for me, as somebody who knows nothing about the French Revolution, I'm not going to start worshipping Marie Antoinette, so it was just interesting for me as a book. And I found myself multiple times throughout this story going out of my way to Google. I spoiled myself a lot for this book because I kept Googling the people who are obviously real people, and this book does everything that history does. Like, it's realistic in terms of the end point, so you always know it's not going to end very well for any of these characters, but I still just found it so captivating. And I don't know whether it was because there was an element of glamour because of like the glitz of this time period before the French Revolution like really started to kick in, but I found it so compelling and so captivating. And I love that these sisters took two different paths. I loved how they grew apart and also grew together. I can't tell you why, because like literally I expected to hate it, but I didn't. So for this one, I'm gonna go with need a sequel like yesterday. The book in itself doesn't need a sequel. It did everything I wanted it to, and I would never need any more from this story. But I know that Kate Hartfield has a book that's coming out next year that has Norse mythology in it, and I'm definitely going to be picking that one up based on my enjoyment of the embroidered book. The Final Strife by Sarah Elarifi, another recent read for me and one that I really loved. I gave it 4 stars. So this one is set in a society where everybody is divided by the colour of their blood. Right at the bottom of the pile we have people with translucent blood who have been persecuted for a rebellion a few hundred years ago, and because of that at birth they have their hands and their tongues cut off. Quite brutal, definitely an adult book, lots of content warnings in here, but they have been mutilated and their race is mutilated as like a standard now, and they are the servant class. Above this we have the blue bloods. They are, I guess, the peasant class. There are a few merchants that can rise up a little bit, but they're generally just like slightly below the general population. And then we have the reds. The reds are the royalty or like nobility, I guess, and also just like the general civilians of this world. Like with standard society, you can have poor reds, but you're just not subjected to the amount of barbarity that the blue bloods or the translucent bloods are, just because your blood is red. So we're following 3 characters, 3 female characters in this world, one from each of these classes. And our main character, I would say, is Scylla, who is a red blood that has been raised as a blue blood, and she ends up infiltrating the keep and meets a red blood called Honor. And the plot of this is structured around a series of trials that is performed every 10 years to find out who the next warden is going to eventually be. So there's 4 wardens and they rule like a separate sector. So there's like strength, which is like the army, and there's duty, which is like the law, and then there's like 2 others. So the plot is centered around the trials that selects the strongest red-blooded people to become the next rulers of the land. I really enjoyed this story. I like that it took me on a ride, even romantically. I wasn't in this for the romance. I don't feel like the romance was particularly well done. I don't feel like the romance was necessary 100%. If you're gonna do romance in a fantasy and make it integral, you got to do it like fantasy romance. You got to make me root for it, you know? Whereas if it's a fantasy and I'm in it for the fantasy elements and plotline, I don't need the romance. So the romance was fine, but like it wasn't the best romance. I'm not criticizing it too much because that's not what I was in the book for. The complexity of the world I loved. the complexity of the plot, providing it delivers in book 2. I loved. What I hated is that this celebrates so many marginalized communities, but it was weirdly fatphobic in the way that the character that was plus size, the characters were praising her curves while the author was tearing her down in the description. So it would say, like, Silo would say that her curves were so sexy and she admired her, and then in the description it would be like, Honor stood there like a lump of lard. And it didn't make any sense to me. That's the only thing that pretty much dragged this down for me. That, and that there are a few conveniences within the plot at the beginning and the end, like the characters getting into the situations they need to be in for the plot to kick off. Not the most believable things, but otherwise I had an amazing time. So we're gonna go with need a sequel like yesterday, because I am really hyped to continue this one. I feel like we're doing well this year with the amount of sequels that we want. Next up we have The Collarbone by Rebecca Zanabi, which I think was what I wanted to be my favorite book of one of my Goldsboro installments, and it just didn't work out for me. I cannot remember anything about this. This is a problem. Oh, that's really sad because I enjoyed it. So this is, one of the characters is a collarbound, which is like a slave, and the other one is, I could tell you who they are in terms of spoilers, but I couldn't actually tell you who they are. There are mages in this world that think they're above everybody, and there's a rebellion that is coming to liberate everybody, but the way that they're doing it is pretty barbaric, so actually no better than the oppression faced from the mages. We're following two main characters, one of which is a collarbound and a slave, but there's a lot of mystery surrounding like who his master actually is, and one of them is this mysterious apprentice that has turned up, and she is actually, she's marked, she's tattooed, so people think that she is a member of a class, like an underclass, that she isn't actually a member of, and that causes a lot of problems and a lot of oppression for her. My criticism with this is that I liked the world, I liked the characters, but it had absolutely no plot. It felt like a prequel where we were introducing characters and setting up things for the rest of the series to then have a plot, which, I mean, you could say that about the Final Strife, but we had a plot. We had the structure of these trials, which provided a plot, while we were also getting accustomed to the characters and the world and the like political and societal system, whereas Collarbone did that but without any kind of plot, which is my issue, and also why I don't remember too much about it. Now, that being said, I am interested in a sequel because I think that this was very promising. It just needed more than it gave me. So for that reason, we're gonna go with good. Realistically, it is hovering between forgettable and need a sequel like yesterday. And that's the reason why we're putting it in good, because I do think that a sequel is very promising, but at the same time, with what this book gave me, I remember very little about it. And then finally, the last book that we have to tier rank is a disappointment to me, but not because of the book, but because of the way it was sold to me. So this is You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty by Okweke Emezi, who is known for writing a series of books that are not romance. So Okweke Emezi is not an author I feel that I will ever read from, because I feel like they are mainly known for things like literary fiction and contemporary fiction, which is just not my cup of tea. And this was sent to me in the Illumicrate Afterlight box, which is a romance subscription that I sign up to. So I expected a romance from this book, even though I'd seen it in a bookshop, and I thought, based on what I'd seen of this book, that it wasn't a romance. When I received it in a romance subscription, that changed my mind. So the synopsis of this is very vague. It says that it is about a woman who is escaping the heat of the city for an island getaway. Like, she's offered this opportunity to go to this beautiful location on holiday, and she goes and she finds herself falling in love with a man that she can't have, like the worst possible person she could fall in love with. That is literally all it says. But if you asked me to describe this book, I would say that this is about a woman who lost her husband. Her husband died, okay? And this book is about her grieving her husband, coming to terms with his loss, and picking herself up and deciding to live again. So my issue with this book is that it's not a romance. Excuse you. If it is, it's like, I would call it a contemporary fiction or like a literary romance. It's not for, I would say, your typical romance reader, which is why I didn't like it. What I don't like about romance is when it's presented as a romance and you have a, I feel like you have a set of expectations, especially of such a vague synopsis, of what a romance with a vague synopsis like this would be. And it slaps you in the face with the fact that it's actually about grief. Like, that's not something that I want to be blindsided by. So for that reason, I did not enjoy this book, because I expected it to be a romance. And it's just not. That's not what it's about for me. While it does have a romantic theme, like it's about her starting to date again and put herself out there again and coming to terms with herself and deciding to live again. While it had a lot of like angsty queer characters in it that were super messy. The romance in itself wasn't messy. It was like one of the most wholesome things I've ever read. So for me, it was forgettable. If I'd have known what it was, I probably wouldn't have read it because it's just literally not my kind of thing. And I think the book in itself is good if you know what it is and that's what you want to read, and if you like contemporary fiction or literary fiction, but I don't. And so I didn't like this book. So looking at that, I'm actually quite happy. I mean, the fact that Forgettable is almost as equal as Need a Sequel Like Yesterday isn't ideal, but it could have been much worse. We don't often have many things in the obsessed category because I'm not the most critical person in the world, but I do feel like the more I read, the more critical I'm becoming, and the amount of books that make it to my favorite things ever is less and less every year. So these books accounted for approximately a quarter of all of the books I've read in 2022. I want you guys to put down in the comments actually, because I think that I don't read a lot of new releases. I wouldn't class myself as somebody who prioritizes new releases in any way unless they're super anticipated for me personally, like the newest book in one of my favorite series. Do you think that 25% of all of the books that you read in a year is a lot? Like, would you consider that a considerable amount? Because realistically, a quarter of the books that I've read is a lot, but I still don't consider myself to be somebody who reads a ton of new releases. But aside from that, guys, I do hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope if any of these books were on your radar, I hope it's helped you maybe decide which ones may actually live up to the hype. And aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head down to my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram, and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish Candle website, the Instagram for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you're go when nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.